Is where we'll be. We're still on 11 back there, Lena. If you don't have that up, that's where we're at. We continue to look at the rebellions here of the Israelites, them not wanting to go into the promised land for fear of giants and civilizations and large walls and all the reasons that complaints, concerns they gave Moses on why they shouldn't go in. We saw the breaking of the Sabbath rebellion. We saw the rebellion against Moses and Aaron last week. Korah and the rebels, I guess, that kind of rose up to try to overthrow Moses and Aaron because of their position that God had granted them because of their faithfulness, obviously. Today we look at Moses' rebellion. All right, now Moses has a history throughout this study of being inquisitory of the things God has asked him to do. He always eventually does them, but he never just kind of jumps out as soon as God says to go and go. As he gets older and progresses through his leadership, we see him being a little more forthright in his obedience. But today we're going to see Moses' rebellion against God. God's going to ask him to do something, and he's going to do it not in the way in which God had required. Now, as we get into this story, of course, we know it very well. God tells Moses to speak to the rock so the water will come forth. Moses takes his staff and smacks the rock. And as we get into this, I'm going to... Moses should have obeyed God. I'm going to err on the side of I can understand where Moses is coming from. I think Moses' rebellion here is out of not just pure disobedience, but somewhat out of just exasperation for the idiots that he was in charge of. And he should not have been, not justifying his actions. He should not have done what he did. But I think just his sinful nature took over, and he was just so exasperated with this situation and what was going on that he kind of lashed out. Which, again, another really important lesson for us that we're going to kind of look at today. That, even we may think sometimes righteous anger in our own part is not necessarily the case, right? We continue to allow God to take care of things and to handle things. Even at moments where we're just like, I'm trying to do the best that I can. It's still important for us to let God be in control and to be obedient to his word. Now, so Numbers chapter 20 is where this account takes place. Now, the actual record of Israel's time in the wilderness, the 40 years, there's not a whole lot written about it. The record of things kind of going on is really rather sparse. But what we do have recorded of the kind of the wandering around, in the wilderness, is important. And no event more important than the rebellion here of Moses at Kadesh. Okay. Now, as we see this in Numbers chapter 20, more than likely the Israelites are kind of coming to the end of their time in the wilderness. Okay, this is, don't know the exact time frame, but it's they're on the back end slide of their 40 years wandering around. Okay. And they see it one more time. God has up. So I think this is important to kind of timeline this. This is not the start of the 40 years. This is kind of towards the end of the 40 years. And we see them once again complaining about not having water. Okay? Now, if you put this into context, for 39 and a half years, let's say, just for the sake of the conversation, who has been providing them water while in the wilderness? God has, right? So we come to the last 6 months of this wandering around, and why are they complaining about God not giving them what they need? Okay, we see even after the 40 years, okay, or even after this extended time of them wandering around in the wilderness, we still see them not turning over the concerns, not turning over the worry to God. We see them still thinking that they are somewhat special, privileged, however you want to consider it. They still think God's not doing what they think God should do. Okay, even after some time now of God preparing them and them wandering around, in the wilderness. So, if we jump down to verse 8 in chapter 20, that is kind of where this whole account starts. Verse 7, let's go to verse 7. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes. And it shall give forth, then it shall bring forth, it shall give forth his water, and thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. So once again, we see God telling Moses that water is going to come from the rock. Moses was, of course, to speak to it. We see very specifically, God gave him very specific instructions. Take the rod, gather the assembly, you and Aaron, go speak ye unto the rock before their eyes. And if you speak to the rock, what's going to happen? Water is going to come out of the rock. Okay, very simple, very basic instructions. Very straightforward here. We get to verse 9. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear ye now, ye rebels. Must we fetch you water out from this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and the beasts also. So he does, up to this point, he gathers everybody around, he grabs his staff, the rod that he has, and he brings everybody around this rock. And he tells the people, hear ye now, and he calls them what? How does he refer to the congregation here in verse 10? Calls them rebels, right? Now, if you go back and look at the times that Moses addresses the Israelites, and you can, because he's addressed them several times, we usually see Moses referring to the Israelites as what? Children, okay, or a nation, or people, right? He gives them what I would consider an endearing term, and whatever the case may be. We see once again here Moses addressing the children of Israel, the nation that God has given him. And we see him addressing them as rebels, a non-endearing term. So what this leads me to think is that Moses is fed up, right? He's fed up with these people, constantly complaining to him, constantly complaining about what God has given them, constantly complaining the fact that although God is providing them every need, God's still not providing what they think they need or how they think he should do it. So Moses is fed up with him here. And this has been 40 years plus the time prior to the 40 years. Moses has heard these people complain for 2 generations now. And he's sick of it. He's just pure old tired of it. And he calls them rebels and says, Must we again fetch you water out of this rock? So he takes his staff, takes his rod, and hits the rock twice. And of course, we see the water coming forth. Now, I think this is 100% Elanciism, but I think that Moses probably took the staff the first time and gave it a pretty good thwap, right? And nothing happened. And I would imagine Moses rearing back the second time and absolutely swinging the staff as hard as he could possibly swing it. All of his fury, all of his exasperation, all of his fed up withedness pent up and released as he swung and hit the rock. And then the water came forth. Of course, we know that that's not what God told him to do. And so the moment thereafter, in verse 11, the moment the water comes forth, the congregation and the animals, of course, began to drink from that. The moment after, we get to verse 12. And we see the Lord speaking unto Moses, and Aaron specifically. All right? And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron and said, Because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. So because of Moses' rebellion, what is the punishment? He doesn't get to go see the promised land, right? So he doesn't, which, reading this on just a surface level, considering what Moses has done for the last 40 years, this seems like an extremely harsh punishment. It does. Would you all not agree? Moses got called out of the wilderness, called out as a shepherd to go lead the people out of Egypt. He had some questions, but he did it. He led them out of Egypt, got to the Red Sea, and then all the stuff that happens there. Moses was faithful. He had some questions, but he's been pretty faithful. He's listened to these people complain and moan. He's been in charge of them. He's heard their complaints. He's heard their murmurings. He's heard all this stuff. He's interceded on their behalf numerous times. For the most part, Moses has been extremely faithful and been probably a much better leader than anybody else in that camp could have been. We see Moses here rebelling against a direct command from God, and God's punishment seems to be extremely, extremely harsh. He hit the rock when he was supposed to speak to it, and because of that, he tells him that he and Aaron are not going to be able to see the promised land. Moses here fails to believe God in some manner, okay? Calling the people rebels, asking them about the need to fetch water from the rock, are perhaps clues that Moses was frustrated that God was going to provide water for the people again without giving them some form of discipline while they were complaining. Moses' fed-upness. Whatever the reason may have been, hitting the rock in anger, swinging his staff at the rock, instead of speaking to it, was a direct rebellion against God. The punishment for sin is what? What is the punishment for sin? Death. So God not striking Moses dead on the spot and telling him that he's not going to be able to lead the people into the promised land was actually God displaying Moses some mercy. Because God has to do what to sin? Has to judge it. That's who God is. God had the right and should have struck Moses down instantly, because that's what the punishment for rebelling against God is. God, instead of what we consider from a surface value, looking at this, man, that is really stinking harsh on God's behalf. It's actually not. It's actually very merciful, because God should have killed him on the spot. And while we can see Moses' side and see his exasperation and see the reason why he was so tired, he probably wanted to take that stick and swing at those people. And rightfully, probably so. We could have seen why he would have wanted to do that and started just beating them with it because of the way they've acted. God still gave him a direct order. God still put him in charge, and God still told him to speak to the rock instead of just swinging a stick at it. So while I would say to anybody reading this story, man, that's really harsh. In reality, God is displaying and giving Moses quite a bit of mercy. What message is Moses sending to the people about submitting to God's will when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it? What message is he sending to the people about submitting to the will of God?
Sometimes God needs us to perform as well.
Exactly, right? Somehow God needs us to perform as well. And then when Moses was in direct rebellion of what God told him to do, well, then the people said, well, we're just supposed to speak to it, and he swung the stick at it. Maybe we don't, and we still got the water. Maybe we really don't need to listen to what God had to say. So, because Moses being the leader, Moses being the kind of the intercessory on God's behalf for the people, and because of his rebellious act, not only was it rebellious to Moses, but it was being a bad example to the people that were around as well. Verse 22 of chapter 20. Jump down to verse 22. And the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came into the Mount Hor. So after this event takes place, Moses realized kind of what's going on here. He has the punishment passed out to him. The nation then journeys from Kadesh to Mount Hor. All right, so let's go back and see our map here so we can kind of figure out exactly where we are at. Let's see, Kadesh. Kadesh Barnea, it's not quite the same. It might not be on here. I thought it was exactly where we're at. Maybe there's another one. Maybe there's another map. I thought I had it up here. Maybe I didn't put it on here. Maybe not. Anywho. So after that event, they head towards Mount Hor, and this is now the time for Aaron to die. It was time for him to come. And time for his life to end. So verse 23 down through the rest of the chapter gives us the event here of Aaron essentially realizing that his time had come to pass. That he's going to be passed down the priestly garments. Of course, being the high priest, he's going to pass those down to his son Eleazar as Aaron realizes that his time has come. Again, because of the rebellion that took place there where Moses struck the rock. If Moses would have just simply spoken to the rock, both he and Aaron would have led the people into the promised land. They would have seen the end goal of the 40 years of them wandering around, and Moses would have had probably some satisfaction in the tumultuous task that he took on, but it was not the case. Verse 23, and the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the coast of the land of Edom. Let's see if we can give us a better explanation. I like to know where I'm at. Edom, here we go. On the coast of Edom, so Edom, we see Petra, right? I can't give you that because you don't see it. But we see Edom and Petra. Are you with me? Here's Edom. Here's Petra. So on the coast of Edom, so we're in somewhere in this area around in here is where they're at right now. Okay? So it's where Aaron is going to go, and we're going to pass on the high priest's garments to his son. Verse 24, and Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not enter into the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because ye rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar, his son, and bring them up into the Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, and shall die there. And Moses did as the Lord commanded, and they went up into the Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. And Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, and put them upon Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there in the top of the mountain, and Moses and Eleazar came down from the mount, and when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. So they journeyed from Kadesh over to Mount Hor, and Aaron and Moses and his son Eleazar head up to Mount Hor. There's where Moses, essentially the passing of the garb of the high priest takes place. Aaron is stripped of his garments and given them there to his son Eleazar, and this is in the midst of all of them. People know, the children of Israel know what's happening, right? They're there and they know exactly what's being taking place. They actually see the garments being kind of transferred over to Eleazar, so they understand that he is now the high priest. Aaron then, of course, dies shortly after, just as God had intended, and the reason being, one more time, is displayed and explained in those verses. Because of their disobedience and because of rebellion is why they weren't going to be able to see the promised land. That brings us to chapter 21, and we now see the Israelites kind of becoming, we see the first battle, I guess you could say, the first other nation battle they've had to deal with. That begins in chapter 21. So we start chapter 21, so the first 4 verses, we see Israel defeating the Canaanites here at Orma. And when the king Arad, the Canaanite, which dwelt in the south, heard tell that Israel came by the way of the spies, that he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners. And Israel vowed a vow unto the Lord and said, if thou wilt indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And the Lord hearkened to the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them in their cities. And he called the name of the place Orma. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. All right, so we see the first battle with other Canaanites. The Canaanite king Arad knew that the spies had come in. Right, he knew the Israelites were around. He knew that the spies were there. So he went in and he captured some of the Israelites. And as we read through those 4 verses, we see that the nation of Israel comes to God and says, if you will help us, deliver us from these people, we'll make sure that we're being faithful, we'll make sure we're being obedient. So we see them saying, God, help, what they should have done to start with. We see them kind of stepping in and saying, all right, we understand that, God, you are the one that's going to deliver these people to us. Please do so, and we will be faithful to you. It is essentially what kind of in an eggshell, kind of what that says. Okay? So God does that. We see them not just going in and defeating the Canaanites, but in verse 3 it says they do what? Utterly destroy them and their cities. Now, they don't just go in and kind of win the battle. They wipe them out, okay? And their cities as well. So God does exactly as the Israelites had asked. So we would expect the Israelites to do exactly as they said that they would, okay? But as they have now defeated the Canaanites and are moving through the land of Edom, we see that the journey got a little bit long and a little bit laborious on them, right? And in verse 4, not long after they had just destroyed the Canaanites, what do we see the people of Israel doing? As they're moving through the land of Edom, the last part of verse 4 says they did what? Got discouraged, and they got discouraged because the journey was harder than what they thought it should have been. Go to verse 5. And the people spake against God and against Moses, wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. So we see now another example of the Israelites complaining against God. As they're moving through, they get tired, they get hungry, and they're wanting to know where the water's at and where the bread's at. Because the bread that what they were being supplied with on a daily basis, as we see at the end of verse 5, is what? The soul laboreth what? This light bread. What is the light bread their soul is laboring about? It's the manna. God has been continuing to give them manna throughout their journey through the wilderness. He's continuing to give them as they're moving up through the land of Edom after they've destroyed Canaan, and He's been giving them this every day. And the Israelites go to Moses again and complain one more time because they don't have water, and they're tired of eating the manna. Right? They want something else. They're tired of eating what God has been providing for them. So we see the Israelites again, just a few days before, said, all right, God, if you'll help us defeat the Canaanites, then we'll be faithful. And then God helps them defeat the Canaanites, and they move, the journey gets a little bit more difficult than they thought, and we see them complaining again. And they go back to the same old complaint and the same old statement that they've made now numerous times, right? Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to let us die? Why did you bring us out of slavery if you're just going to be here and let us die? The Israelites have very quickly forgotten how difficult things were for them while they were in Egypt. Yeah, they were able to eat some stuff, and then they might even had a bit of a house over their heads and probably water and stuff to drink. But they forget the labor and the work and the how terrible slavery was, and they've forgotten it very, very quickly. I always complain about leaving out of Egypt when God moved them from slavery. It's amazing to me that they always go back to that same complaint. So they're tired of the manna, and they want something else. And they're complaining to Moses, and they're complaining to God about this. They hadn't given them any water or whatever. I mean, the manna was tired of it. This time we see, though, instead of God just giving them what they need or giving them what they want, we see Him judging them. As we get to verse 5 and 6, a pretty famous part of the story is, of course, He brings the fiery serpents in. And they kind of begin to ravage through the camp. Verse 5, and people spake again to Moses, wherefore have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water. Our soul loatheth this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord, that He take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, which he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. So they complained about God giving them what they want. When God judges them, they come to Moses and I guess see the error of their ways and want Moses to intercede one more time on their behalf. God tells Moses specifically what to do, to erect this bronze serpent to which those who were bitten could crawl out of their beds or whatever it was. If they could just get their eyes on this serpent, they could look to that and they would not die from these bites. Okay, now the serpent that I mentioned this last week, that little ambulance symbol that we see of the snake kind of going around the little serpent, the little pole-looking thing. This is where that comes from. Okay, is this little symbol here of God using this statue, using this serpent going up on this pole to help save these people. That's exactly where that comes from. Okay, that's why that's used on ambulances and stuff today. So it's kind of neat, kind of interesting to see that's there. But God uses this, and Moses does exactly what he's told. And of course, prior to the erection of this statue, lots of people were dying from these snake bites, these vipers or fiery serpents, or whatever it was that came in. So perhaps the judgment and then the salvation that came after was a lesson for Moses here, as he, of course, is coming close to the end of his life as well. He could trust God to be just, he could trust God to be merciful, and he could trust God to be gracious. All part of God's glory had revealed to Moses, all part of God's glory God had revealed to Moses while he was on Mount Sinai, which of course was over in Exodus chapter 33. Okay, so that gives us Moses' rebellion. Now, we're not going to get into this week because we don't have time. We're going to get into it next week. But now we're going to see another interesting character kind of come in to play with Balaam. Now, Balaam's an interesting guy. He was a notable, what they call diviner, and he was familiar to multiple ancient people groups. Okay, so there's stories. There's accounts about Balaam in a lot of the ancient civilizations that are around during this time. Okay, we see him in, of course, the scriptures. You see him in some of the other civilizations' writings and things as well. So Balaam was kind of well known, and he's kind of a big character in this area around this time. And a matter of fact, he was so well known, I guess his notoriety kind of spills over into the New Testament. 2 Peter and Jude as well talks about Balaam. Now, those two accounts kind of put him in a negative light because, of course, as we're going to see next week, he profits from evil. And other passages in scriptures as well condemn Balaam. But Balaam is going to show up here as a foreigner who knew God by his covenantal name and blessed Israel and gave out some prophecies. And we're going to take a dive into Balaam and his character here over probably the next couple of weeks. So that starts in Numbers chapter 22. And of course, we know the famous story is that Balaam is trying to get his donkey to move, and eventually the donkey talks to him, right? And tells him he's not trying to be rebellious, it's just the way it is. So we're going to get into that. So we'll probably spend the next couple of weeks talking about Balaam because he's a pretty interesting character. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson today. Thank you for the understanding that regardless of how faithful, regardless of how good of a Christian we think we are, one rebellious act is enough, Lord, to show just exactly how much you despise the sin and therefore how much we should stay away from it. Moses, a picture of faithfulness and a picture of leadership and servitude, but even he, in a moment of weakness, in a moment of exasperation, made a mistake, slipped up, and was rebellious against you and faced the consequences as well. I think that should be a good reminder to us too, Lord. And we may think we're trying to do the best we can, and sometimes get exasperated with the people around us, or that unsaved loved one, or that coworker who's just a pain in the rear end, or whatever the case may be. It's important for us to remember who we serve and what it means to serve you. So I pray that as a constant reminder for us this week and as we move forward in the weeks to come as well. I pray for Pastor Rob, Lord, as he comes here in the next few minutes, and you'll gives us the message you've given him today. Keep us attentive to the word this morning. In your name I pray. Amen.